Welcome to David Game Horizon Pods. In this podcast, we will look at the importance of the microbiome and microbiota and how important it is for our health. And today I have with me John Dalton, who is the co-principal of David Game College. Welcome, John.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much.
Before we start, John, could you tell me briefly about your background and your role here at David Game College, as well as your interest in medicine?
Well, I graduate as a sort of biochemist with an interest in cell biology, and I end up teaching for a year or so, biology and chemistry. And then I leave teaching to enter into publishing, and I became a medical editor. And I was very fortunate to become managing editor of one of the world's most prestigious medical journals, Current Opinion in Gastroenterology, right, which is a little bit of a link to where we're going today.
Absolutely.
And it was a very stressful job, and eventually it got too much for me. So they sort of waved a P45 at me and said, it's not working. After about 2 years, it was too much pressure. I was too young. And I went back into teaching, and that's when I met David. And 30 plus years later, I'm now head of science and co-principal.
All right. Excellent. And so that's kind of your interest in education. And then how did you become interested in the medicine and that side of the of biology?
I think it's important as a caveat today to point out that everything I talk about is from the biological perspective. I'm not a clinician. But I have always had an interest in, since I was editing the medical journal, I had stints on other journals as well, anesthesiology, cardiology, and I also worked with some top medics. I worked with Professor Bourne at the William Harvey Research Institute in St Bartholomew's Hospital. I was the editor of his book, which was on atherosclerosis. And I used to have to go to all the sort of medical libraries and get pictures and stuff. I think my fascination emanates from there. And I suppose I've always wanted to be a medic, but I don't have the right personality, so I'm glad I didn't become one.
No, I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you have all the qualities to become one. Right, so now we're going to delve into the life of a microbiome and also of microbiota. These are really, really important words, and I'm sure very important within the ecosystem of our body as well. So tell me, John, what is a microbiome and why is it so important?
Okay, so at its simplest, a microbiome is a collection of microorganisms living together. That's a very simple definition. More specifically, it's the microbial communities are defined as what we call multi-species assemblies, in which microorganisms interact with each other in a continuous environment. It's a rather sort of loaded way of saying it.
Yes.
What is important, before we get into a slightly easier definition, is that everyone's microbiome, everyone's collection of microorganisms in and on their body, because it's on your skin as well, is unique. Right. It's as unique as your fingerprint. And that in its own right is quite fascinating. Right. So the term micro is fairly obvious. The term biome, well, biome emphasizes that the microbial community is akin to an ecosystem within the body or some other defined environment. And it's all about the ecology and ecosystem of microorganisms on and within us. And in actual fact, there are two separate definitions. The microbiota, which you alluded, well, you didn't allude, you said it earlier,
did, yes.
You actually used the term, and the microbiome are often used interchangeably, but if you're going to be precise, they shouldn't. The microbiota is what we're specifically talking about today, which is the groups of microorganisms living on and within your body, and that could be oral microbial ecosystem, your gut system, your skin system. And the microbiome is a much broader term, and that refers to the collection of genomes from all the microorganisms in an environment. So you could have a microbiome from this room,
right?
Because it's going to be made up of the microbes of who's been in this room.
So let me just stop there. We're using these words to describe elements like bacteria or virus.
Okay. So what's it made up of?
And what is made up of? Because I think the important thing is to understand, for a layman to understand who's going to be listening to this podcast, is where are they? Are they you said in the gut?
Okay.
And you said on the skin.
Yeah.
How many of them are there?
Well, there's about 100 trillion.
100 trillion
in and on you in terms of total number. That's just bacteria.
Yeah.
God knows how many viruses. But I think before we answer that question, with your permission,
of course,
I'd like to take a little step back, because the term microbiome is an interesting one, because there are different types of microbiomes recognised.
Right.
One, of course, well, let's just have a look at the actual sort of main types. There's a marine microbiome. That's the total number of genomes of all different species inside in the sea. There's a freshwater one. There's a soil one. There's a microbiome of a forest. There's a microbiome of the atmosphere.
Right.
There's a microbiome of an agricultural microbiome. There's a built environment like where we are now that has its own microbiome.
Yes.
So now this college will be made up of millions and millions and millions of bacteria, viruses, fungi, and sometimes parasitic worms, which students and staff will carry in and out. And you can test that.
Are these airborne as well as
They'll be airborne,
physical,
surface
and everywhere?
Everywhere.
And on the carpets,
Yep,
everywhere?
You name it.
Oh, wow.
Anywhere where there's a surface, there's a desert microbiome.
Wow.
And one of the most fascinating ones is the plant microbiome. And these are, the microbiome is really quite fascinating as a concept.
Okay.
Because, for example, if we look at something like the sea.
Yes.
If we take seawater, it's amazing what it contains in terms of total numbers. So, for example, you'll find that even a small amount of seawater, let's say 1 litre of seawater, has an estimated 10 billion viruses.
10 billion?
Billion. 1 teaspoon of seawater contains 50 million viruses, and if you do the maths, that actually works out.
So when I'm swimming in the sea and I open my mouth and I just get seawater in it,
you're
taking
in billions of viruses. Most of them are harmless phage viruses, which have no impact on humans. In fact, they attack bacteria.
Right.
And viruses are the most numerous biological agents of the human microbiome, and all microbiomes. 1 gram of soil can contain from 10 million to 10 billion bacteria, and 1 billion to 10 billion viruses. That's 1 gram of soil. And these viruses are known as endogenous viral elements, or EVSs. So that's just one example of the numbers of viruses. Bacteria, there are so many of them.
Let me just, let me go back to the constituents or the elements of a microbiome. I mean, what are the elements within? Are the elements of the bacteria?
Okay.
Is this what it is, or
the broader concept is the microbiome?
Yes.
But if we're going to narrow it down to the microbiota, which is specifically on your body, for example, they are. So the microorganisms involved are viruses, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, parasitic worms called helminths, and there's also another primitive group of bacteria called archaeobacteria.
Right.
Now, the viruses, that's known as the virome, bacteria known as the bacteriome, fungi are known as the mycobiome, protozoa are the protistome, and it goes on.
Right.
And the archaeobacteria produce lots of methane. But where are these groups found? They're found in the gut.
Exactly, yes.
They're found on the skin. They're found in the reproductive tract, especially of women, because the reproductive tract is open, ours is slightly closed.
Yes.
They're found in the urogenital tract, the oral cavity, that's the second largest numbers of microorganisms after the gut, in particular colon. They're found in the respiratory tract, they're found in the ears, and they're found in the eyes.
Right.
So these are the main places. Now, the vast majority of microorganisms are found in the large intestine, the colon, and in the mouth.
Okay. So, I mean, what can determine then someone's microbiome and and my health? I mean, how do I know? I mean, I've got these trillions of microbiota in me, and so how do I know I'm healthy?
Well, it's a good question. Don't forget, this is a very complex, multidisciplinary science, and my knowledge of it is probably tiny. You'd have to talk to a clinical specialist to get that answer.
Yes.
But in a general note, there's something called dysbiosis. And dysbiosis is when your microbiota, we're going to stick to the term microbiome from now because they're used interchangeably, but there are subtle differences, but it doesn't matter. At this level, it doesn't matter.
Yes.
It means when your microbiome isn't in balance.
Okay.
So where you do not have a good balance of microbes inside, especially your gut, it can lead to all sorts of diseases, which we'll come on to. But I want to go back, if it's okay,
Yes.
to answer, because you asked another really important question, which is why is it important?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, I did.
So
yes.
basically, the microbiome has, frankly, a profound effect on every aspect of our physical, physiological, and even mental health. A healthy microbiome promotes all aspects of health.
Right.
And where there's an imbalance, as I said earlier, it causes what's called dysbiosis, and you end up in a dysbiotic state, which can exacerbate or trigger a disease. An imbalanced microbiome is implicated in Alzheimer's disease. It's implicated in Parkinson's disease. It's implicated in lots of gastrointestinal disorders, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, autoimmune disease like lupus and rheumatoid arthritis. It's linked to allergies and immune disorders, asthma, eczema.
Right.
It's linked to metabolic diseases such as obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver, and also diabetes.
Right.
It's linked to neurological and psychiatric disorders, depression, anxiety, ASD. It's linked to cancers such as bowel cancer, gastric, liver and pancreatic cancer. And it's also behind cardiovascular diseases such as heart, strokes. So when the microbiome becomes dysbiotic and goes out of balance, it causes chaos to our health.
Okay. So, all right. So, what we're looking at here is diseases, different types of diseases, whether they're direct diseases like cancer or mental health or whatever. But how does that happen? Is it as a result of what we eat? Is it as a result of the air we breathe? I mean, how do we result in getting all these diseases? Don't worry, we'll cut this all out. Don't worry, we'll cut it out. Yeah. So the food that we eat, does it have an impact?
Massive impact. But it's not just that. I think there's something else that we need to bear in mind. You asked earlier as well another really important question. What determines someone's microbiome?
Yes.
There are three forces which shape how long you'll live and your possible disease risk exposure. And I'm simplifying here to be honest.
Yes.
One is your genome, your genetics. Not much we can do about that.
Right.
Two is what we call your exposome. Now, your exposome is all your behavior, the food you eat, whether you smoke, and all the chemicals that you're exposed to in modernity.
Yes.
And there are so many.
Right.
I mean, phthalates for just one example in plastics. And the third force is the microbiome itself.
Right.
And there is something called a phenome, which is all the measurable and physical chemical influences and characteristics of the human body. Now, with the genome, as I said, we all have predispositions, genetic markers for certain diseases. They may not manifest if you don't put in risk factors.
Right.
And there's also another really complex area called epigenetics, but I won't go into that now. As far as the exposome is concerned, you know, people that smoke radically change the microflora of their respiratory tract,
Right.
which leads to diseases. And I mean, even something like kissing. Now, you might think kissing. When you kiss somebody, if you kiss somebody intimately, hope this doesn't generate too many bad images, for 10 seconds,
Yes.
you transfer 80 million bacteria to your partner.
Wow.
And, you know, there's an argument that some people have said, I don't know whether it has validity or not, that, you know, kissing may be an evolved thing to increase microbial diversity between people. Right. I mean, there's so many, that's a bit sort of if-so story, one doesn't know. But,
Absolutely.
I mean, you also asked, why is the microbiome so important? The answer for that is because the bacteria, fungi, and other microbes help us absorb nutrients. The microbes help break down foodstuffs that we can't do ourselves. We don't have enzymes for them. The microbes do it for us.
Right.
They're implicated in vitamin synthesis, vitamin K and B. They have a huge chemical complex relationship with your immune system, which is not fully understood.
Right.
It's a new science.
Right.
Bacteria in particular can signal, can send things. They can encourage the proliferation of T cells. There's a whole range of things they can do. They're very much involved with your metabolic health, obesity and metabolic syndromes. They're regulating and energy harvesting. Microbes are also very much linked to mental health, including possibly autism. They help you protect against many diseases, and they're important in your overall sort of homeostasis.
Okay. Well, through history, has the microbiome changed? And has modernity and urban living and globalization had an impact on them?
Well, that's...
Or impact on microbiota in particular?
That's a really tough question. We could be here. The simple answer is that I think it's a very complex question you ask, but let me have a go. I think we could argue that, or certainly there's a gentleman called Jonathan Kennedy who argues in his book Pathogenesis that germs and pathogens have shaped humanity at every stage from the first success of Homo sapiens. And I think he's right. Microbes have shaped human history. Right. For example, the development of fire changed how we eat, which would have changed the microbiome of the oral cavity and the gut.
Yes.
So the development of fire. Sugar. I mean, sugar really, it goes back, there's sugar in ancient China, and many other civilizations had some sugar, I think. But it really gets to Europe around the medieval, the Crusades time. And you think about how it impacted on Europeans, right, on the oral, the sugary films. All of a sudden, yes, completely different bacterial populations in the mouth trying to break down the sugar. What has the development of toothpaste, fluorinated water, dramatically changed our internal biomes? And indeed, 10,000 years ago, whenever it was, the Neolithic Revolution, the agricultural revolution, we stopped largely being hunter-gatherers and we ended up,
vegetarians.
Well, yeah, I suppose so. Grain,
exactly. Yes.
Harvesting grain and,
yes,
and using the land.
Yes.
And modern agriculture, for example, contains far more toxic forms of gluten. I think it's called peptide 33. I can't remember, which is linked to celiac disease. Right. So, I definitely. I mean, it's a subject for another podcast, I think. but it's an absolutely fascinating area. Yes, definitely urban and modern living. I mean, every time you read a book and you're in a library, you're flicking through the pages, and on those pages are the bacteria and viruses of the people that read before, and you're picking those up. I mean, there's so many microbes on money. I mean, modern living and urbanization and flight,
Yes.
globalization, completely changed. Everyone's
They're carriers, aren't they?
The food.
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm.
You didn't have Indian food, for example, in this country 300 or 400 years ago. Now it's ubiquitous.
Yes.
But that will change. Different cultures, different foods will change everyone's microbiome.
Right. Well, I mean, you mentioned previously about mental health and the microbiome as far as mental health is concerned. But how can the microbes impact our thinking?
Once again, that's a really complex question. There is something called the gut-brain axis, and it gets really complicated. But microbes can influence stress hormones. It may seem a bit far-fetched, but there are certain foods which have been shown to play a role in modulating the activity or the breakdown of those foods, of what we call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates the control of a cortisol. And one of these chemicals affects the gut and brain. Butyrate acts as what's called a histone deacetylase inhibitor, which affects gene expression in cells. And in the gut, butyrate helps maintain the gut barrier function, reduces inflammation. But it also can cross the blood-brain barrier and affect gene expression in the brain.
Right.
In particular, butyrate has been shown to modulate the expression of genes involved in the regulation of that axis I referred to earlier. And it can cause the release of different stress hormones. And I don't understand the full neurochemical implications. You need to get a specialist. But clearly microbes through the gut-brain axis can cause release of stress hormones.
Right.
And they can affect behavior. That's the really scary thing for me, that, you know, if I'm staying up late and all of a sudden I feel guilty, but all of a sudden I feel hungry and I go and make myself a sandwich at 12 or 1 o'clock at night, you know, is that the bacteria controlling my brain through chemicals? Is that the bacteria stimulating my brain to engage in a certain behavior, which if I didn't have a certain type of microbiome, it wouldn't do it.
Right. I mean, so
it's like fast
we
food.
can't. Yeah, I mean, we can't get away from the microbiota. They're there. They're going to be present in us. So, what impact will an emerging understanding of the microbiota and microbiome have on medicine?
Profound. It will have a huge impact on medicine. It will revolutionize it, in my opinion. The understanding that food itself is medicine is an interesting one, what you eat. Of course, the Western diet is terrible, full of things that we shouldn't eat. So,
do you mean
fast food, junk food?
Okay, fast foods and so forth. So what I mean, if people eat, let's say, a Mediterranean diet, which is the olive oil, the salads, and whatever, is it choosing the right food, the right ingredients to put into your body that will then not generate all these diseases?
Well, basically,
is that a simplified version of what?
Yeah, I mean, a Mediterranean diet keeps the microbiome to some extent in balance. It doesn't create a dysbiosis. But if you're, I mean, look at what people are eating. Some people eat a takeaway every night.
Right.
Now, if you think about it, that's full of salt and sugar. Westernized diets have low microbial diversity compared to non-Westernized diets. We know that there's a pandemic of obesity. I don't know the exact figures, but I think something like 25% of adults globally have metabolic syndrome, which is hypertension, fatty belly, they're sluggish, they're inactive.
Yes.
And, I think you just have to look at, I'm tapping my own belly at this point. But the problem here is that all the type of food that we're eating impacts the gut-brain axis. If you eat a lot of plants, that does good things for the brain. I'll give you an example. There is a hormone called leptin, which suppresses your hunger, and there is another hormone called ghrelin, which is it makes you feel hungry, and it stimulates your vagus nerve to go to your brain to say, in actual fact, you're hungry, even when you're not. Yeah. And things like synthetic fructose, fizzy drinks, junk food, it's full of it, synthetic fructose. It doesn't cause obesity in terms of its calorific effect. What it does is it causes resistance to that hormone I talked about earlier, leptin. So if you have resistance to leptin, it means that it's telling your body to keep eating.
Right.
And leptin resistance is associated also with lower microbial diversity in the gut. And synthetic sugars cause inflammation of the gut, meaning that bacteria and toxins can get transferred to the liver, causing it damage. You get steatosis, you get fat accumulation in the liver. And one of the most common aspects of metabolic syndrome is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. As I said earlier, that's 25% of the adult population has that.
My God.
And, you've got all these problems caused by these foods.
So John, when we're...
And there's no fibre in them.
Yeah, well, this is what I was going to say. When I sometimes go to a supermarket and then I pick some, I like this, and I have a look at it. My kids tell me, Dad, make sure it's got a high protein level. Make sure it doesn't have any it's gluten-free or so forth. Is that the way we should be looking at the products we're buying? Or
once again, I think you'd have to ask a nutritionist or clinician that one, because I don't know for a fact, but I'm fairly certain in my own head that nutritional labels are can be quite deceiving.
Right.
So I think it's always important to buy. What one should avoid eating, in my opinion, is processed food. Right. You should try and eat fresh food as much as you can.
Yes.
And eat as much fibre as you can, because fibre is what we call a prebiotic. The microbes love breaking it down, and it produces all sorts of things like short-chain fatty acids and acetate and butyrate, and these promote microbial diversity. And also fibre, for example, is very important in bowel movement and the tract, and that prevents bowel cancer.
Absolutely. So we only have a minute or so to go. I just wanted to ask, this type of podcast would be of interest to your students, and who would find it valuable to actually listen to this?
I think anyone who's got an interest in medicine or biology. I mean, one of my students a few days ago asked me a question about this, and they asked me about whether it was good to be delivered by caesarean section or a natural birth. And my argument was that because of the microbiome, it's better to be delivered through a natural birth, where there are no other risks, because you get there is evidence to show that kids that are born through a natural birth have less issues at an early age, because they get the full microbiome from their mother. And it's the same for breastfeeding.
That's interesting.
Not only do you get the antibiotics, you also get an initial pile of microbes into the gut, and it
kind of kickstarts you.
Kickstarts them, because
right,
it has human milk oligosaccharides, they're called,
yes.
help bacteria grow in the gut. And milk is a natural prebiotic that promotes the growth of beneficial bacterium like Bifidobacterium, and it suppresses others. So these are questions. I mean, it's also, there's so many fascinating aspects. I just don't know anybody who couldn't be fascinated by the concept that microbes can completely control or have direct and indirect impacts on every aspect of possibly. I mean, it could revolutionise mental health.
Absolutely.
It could revolutionise, and of course, one is being, it's not quite the same as, you might understand AI is revolutionising it. Maybe the word revolutionise is too much of a superlative, but it certainly will bring about a change in how we view how to heal ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, there are always more complicated things. There are other variables involved, but of course, you can also get a fecal transplant.
True.
That's a bit extreme, but it certainly does work for some people.
Well, John, that's been very, very interesting, and I've learned a lot from it. And I know that we've got another 6 or 7 podcasts which will follow this one, the first one. I'd like to thank you, John, for your time. And for our listeners, for more information on all of our courses and topics which we discussed in today's podcast, you can find it on davidgamecollege.com. And thank you to all the listeners, and look forward to the next series of podcasts from you, John. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Theo.